Let me just say a few quick words, if I may. I think all of us will be familiar with Professor Sükrü Hanioglu. First of all, of course, welcome. I'm Hendrik Sprout, the director of the Buffett Center, immediately next door. And we fund, among other things, the Modern Turkish Studies program here, thanks to the gift by Meli and Zeynep Kamen, who were here a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, could not be here today, but they were in Zurich doing quite well, I assure you. A few quick words about Professor Sükrü Hanioglu. He got his BA and PhD at Istanbul University a few years ago. We'll be diplomatic. Just yesterday. Just yesterday.
As big as possible.
Okay. He is, of course, currently the chair in Near Eastern Studies and director of the program in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Among other places, he's also taught at Columbia University, University of Wisconsin, University of Michigan, University of Chicago, and the list goes on. He has many publications to his credit, and today he'll be talking about his latest book, which should have been out, but is immediately forthcoming. If you're interested, his topic of today will be the biography of Ataturk. On the back of the flyer that we're circulating, that Rita has the back of the room, you could order the book. It should be out any moment. It was supposed to be out in April, so unfortunately delayed. But we look forward to a very interesting talk. Let me just say before we begin, for a generalist, international relations scholar that I am, generalist means we don't know anything of empirical detail, we just have very broad theories. But I find the whole transformation of the late Ottoman period into modern Turkey a fascinating episode. And when I'm thinking cross-historically, it is a time when, to use Christopher Hill, the 17th century historian of England, he used the metaphor, a world turned upside down. And it seems to me that the late Ottoman period and the transition to modern Turkey was indeed the world turned upside down, where virtually everything changed. Script, dress codes, the whole outlook on how the modern state was to evolve, and indeed the geographic space of what would be modern Turkey. So a huge transition. But also a transition identified with one person. And clearly there are revolutions, right? The French Revolution, or 6 revolutions if you talk to a French historian, right? Where everything changes in a short period of time, including the calendar and what have you. But rarely do we see episodes where a transformation happens almost around a singular charismatic individual, if you will. Ataturk is one of the very few instances I could think of, if I were to stretch, maybe the Meiji Restoration in Japan. But otherwise, this is I would say, a world historical event. So I very much look forward to this evening's conversation. And please join me in welcoming Professor Hanioglu.
Well, many thanks indeed for this very kind introduction. This is and let me start my presentation by thanking to Cayman Modern Turkish Studies Center and Rita Koryan for actually inviting me to speak to a distinguished audience this afternoon. It is both an honor and pleasure to be at this forum. As you know, you have just heard, the book was supposed to be out actually in April, but hopefully it will be out soon, hopefully next week. And this is really the first presentation that I'm really making about actually this book. So I'm particularly happy about that. So today I would like to briefly, very briefly discuss the theoretical, framework of my most recent book, Ataturk: An Intellectual Biography. I'll try to be, as brief as possible, and then hopefully we'll have a long, Q&A session. Biography, according to one dictionary definition, is the story of one person's life written by another person. Thus, writing a biography is in and of itself a challenge. The intimacy is engrossing, and the responsibility to accurately record a person's life and ideas within the historical context can be overwhelming. Anyone who wishes to write a biography of the founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, faces additional challenges, however. For many years, the scholar who aspired to portray Atatürk as he really was resembled the pre-modern historian rash enough to attempt a depiction of the historical Jesus. Not surprisingly, the more scholarly and authoritative biographies of Atatürk have been authored by non-Turkish scholars, and even these long after his death. Today, as we all know, the subject can be dealt with more openly in Turkey, but demythologizing Atatürk is still difficult. For instance, many of the sayings attributed to Atatürk have become national maxims in Turkey. And yet, a good number of them are fabrications that were invented to serve particular interests. In recent years, some scholars have taken to exposing these fabrications with a passion reminiscent of the great medieval critic of hadith, al-Bukhari. Turkish taxi and trucking associations were not particularly pleased to learn that Atatürk never uttered their organizational motto, "The Turkish driver is a man of the noblest feelings." But broader sectors of society were affected by the revelation that the following quotations were never said by the founder of the Turkish Republic. Quote, "A society that does not respect its elderly is not a real society." Carved on the wall of the Social Security headquarters in Ankara. "The future is in the skies," engraved on placards in commercial airplanes. Or, "If an issue is related to the fatherland, the rest should be considered trivial." The motto of an ultra-secular nationalist movement in Turkey. Hundreds of books have been written on different aspects of Atatürk's life and work. Their titles ranging from Atatürk and Medical Students and Atatürk and Meteorology, so this is really a book, Atatürk and Meteorology, to Atatürk and Eurasia, or even Atatürk's love for children. Most of these are in form of eulogies that depict the founder of modern Turkey as a sage-like dispenser of wisdom, endowed with omniscience and insight in a variety of fields, or even as a philosopher king who strove to lay down laws. Only a small number are solid monographs. Essayists have used his alleged views to prove almost any point. Thus, we have both Atatürk was an anti-communist and the socialist movement Atatürk and the Constitution. Or, I looked for Atatürk in the Quran and found him, alongside Atatürk and science. Meanwhile, Turkish official history tends to portray Atatürk as a leader from birth and attempts to present his world through the prism of the person rather than vice versa. In Turkey, for instance, there are still history professors who consider Mustafa Kemal the architect of the 1908 Young Turk Revolution, even though his actual role was extremely marginal. Similarly, for many years, Turkish historiography maintained that Mustafa Kemal had warned American Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur in 1932 about an imminent general war that would destroy the civilized world. On this basis, many Turkish scholars have credited Atatürk with having foreseen the Second World War even before the Nazis ascended to power. Recent research, however, has revealed that Atatürk told MacArthur exactly the opposite. The minutes of the meeting read, quote, "When the possible dangers of war were discussed, His Excellency the Ghazi said that the occurrence of a world war in the next 10 years was virtually impossible." End of quote. Thus, any scholar seeking to grapple with the historical Atatürk must engage primarily in demythologizing, historicizing, and contextualizing through the use of primary source material. And this is no easy task. While many relevant documents have been published, both during his lifetime and afterwards, only recently a publishing house attempted to bring together all his accessible writings speeches, and correspondence. The resulting collection, whose publication began in 1998, has currently reached volume 26, thus covering the years between 1903 and 1934. As for his personal notes, Mustafa Kemal, like many other contemporary Ottoman Turkish officers, scribbled them in a number of notebooks. Some of these are in diary form and range from 1904 to 1933. His adopted daughter, Professor Afet İnan, produced a sanitized version of one of these diaries, extending over 6 notebooks. An additional 32 are located in the military archives, in the presidential archives, the Çankaya archives, and the Anıtkabir archives in Ankara. And a decision was taken to publish them in 12 volumes. So far, 9 have been issued, with the latest appearing in 2008. The rich collection of materials pertaining to Ataturk, located in the presidential archives at Çankaya, is off limits to scholars without special permission. Likewise, all hopes for access to his divorced wife's personal papers, which had been classified for 25 years after her death in 1975, were dashed in 2005 when they were placed under lock and key indefinitely in the archives of the Turkish Historical Association. Nevertheless, there is no shortage of accessible material with which to work, and the series historian's task consists mainly of separating strands of fact from the considerable body of fiction that has accumulated since Ataturk's death. I found Ataturk's own writings, speeches, and correspondence to be immensely helpful. Unfortunately, the editors of his collected writings have rendered the original Ottoman text into modern Turkish, sacrificing the subtle nuances of the original text in the process. I therefore felt it necessary to go back to the original published source whenever possible. So this is not always possible. For instance, many documents about Ataturk, or many papers produced by Ataturk, were published in Harp Tarihi Mecmuası. And unfortunately, the originals are located in the military archives, and they are not open to the public. So one can only find text rendered into modern Turkish, not their Ottoman originals in these journals. In addition, I relied heavily upon the notes that Ataturk used to scribble in the margins of books that he read. So this is really a treasure chest for an intellectual historian. The notes that he took he scribbled on margins, or the passages that he underlined, when he read books, and they are all accessible. Finally, I scored major Turkish journals and dailies from the period from 1919 to 1938 in order to collect supplementary information. Although Ataturk's own speeches and writings are by far the most important source for my essay, I consulted a vast selection of secondary literature as well. I used 3 well-written authoritative biographies to place my subject in a larger context. These are studies of Klaus Kreiser, Andrew Mango, and Şerafettin Turan, all of which provide a wealth of detail concerning various aspects of Ataturk's life. While the first 2 are written as scholarly biographies, I'm not saying that they don't have any, factual errors or mistakes, but they are, written as scholarly biographies. Şerafettin Turan's superbly, researched study, the title of which may be rendered into English as A Sui Generis Life and Personality, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, smacks of hagiography. In general, however, given the constraints of writing an essay in search of the historical Ataturk and his intellectual, biography, I avoided taking substantial information from the secondary literature. Obviously, my brief essay does not claim to offer a thorough analysis even of Ataturk's major ideas and politics, let alone a comprehensive biography. It has three major objectives. First, it seeks to place the founder of the modern Turkish Republic in his historical context. This approach shows Ataturk to be an intellectual and social product of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The fact that he led an immense endeavor to create a modern nation-state founded on radically new tenets should not force upon us the conclusion that he changed the course of history by thinking the unthinkable or realizing a vision in an otherwise unimaginable manner. Much Turkish historiography tends to view him as a maker of history, as a maker of history who was unaffected by the world around him and who single-handedly wrote a miracle in the form of modern Turkey. But contrary to this approach of mainstream Turkish historiography, Ataturk should not be viewed as a solitary genius impervious to his upbringing, early socialization, education, institutional membership, social milieu, and intellectual environment. While the enormous impact of his leadership on the shape of the new republic that sprang from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire is undeniable, it does not diminish Ataturk's contribution to Turkish history to recognize that his ideas and actions were molded by the intellectual, social, and political realities of his time. The fact that he sided with avant-garde approaches that had previously received only limited support in Ottoman and Turkish society should not mislead us into believing that he originated novel ideas. Ataturk was no thinker of the order of Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, or Lenin. He was not a philosopher who produced a systematic theory attempting to encompass all aspects of life and society. He was not even a devout disciple of an ideology, nor did he try to reinterpret or implement a philosophy within a society, as the Brazilian leaders did when they made positivism the official ideology of their state. Indeed, a scholar of political theory might find Ataturk's ideas extremely pragmatic and rather thin on content. Rather, he was a down-to-earth leader who strove to realize a vision, not by depending on any one ideology, but utilizing a range of sources without paying much attention to contradictions between them. The magnitude of Mustafa Kemal's achievements should not blind us to the fact that he was not even the initiator of this vision. The westernizers of the Second Constitutional Period had envisaged a Mannheimian utopia in which a scientific society categorically rejected tradition and wholeheartedly embraced a modernity within the parameters of an international civilization. Mustafa Kemal, as an authoritarian savior, this is how these people actually later called Mustafa Kemal, brought this utopia to fruition. Thus, his role was that of an interpreter and executor. More precisely, he was the individual who transformed an intellectual utopia envisaged by a marginal group into a political program, and then proceeded to implement it vigorously as head of state. Consequently, despite the radical changes that it brought about, the Turkish transformation led by Ataturk was not a rupture with the late Ottoman past, but in important respects, its continuation. The ideas he espoused had been widely discussed in detail long before the Republican reforms, and were not novelties originated by the founder of the Republic. Had the Great War not occurred, the normal evolution of Ottoman society would not, in all likelihood, have brought about the triumph of these ideas in the 1920s. Fundamental political and societal changes prompted by the Great War and the subsequent Ottoman collapse provided an unforeseen impetus to this process. These events also weakened existing structures that might otherwise have been better able to oppose radical reforms. Mustafa Kemal's rise to power coincided with and was made possible by the breakdown of the empire, the War of Independence, and the process of state building that followed. The predicament of the Ottoman Empire in the years following the Mudros Armistice of 1918 required a determined and innovative leadership to resist the implementation of the settlement the Allies sought to impose, to create a new political order, to organize an exceedingly difficult military campaign, and then to transform the heartland of the empire into a nation state. Mustafa Kemal's remarkable achievements as a soldier and national leader, who fought and won a war against apparently insurmountable odds, undoubtedly helped him capture the unchallengeable aura of infallibility that came to pervade his leadership. Although it has been overlooked by Western historiography as a minor post-war affair in the Near East, the struggle he led and unexpectedly brought to a triumphant conclusion marked the first challenge to the world order unilaterally imposed by the seemingly invincible victors of the First World War. Only a leader with such astounding record had the power to implement a utopia of the kind envisaged by Mustafa Kemal. Here, Robert Tucker's concept of situationism, according to which societal conditions largely predetermine the characteristics of the individual that will emerge as the leader, is a far better explanatory device for Ataturk's career than the great man theory, most commonly associated with the founder of modern Turkey. The key to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's success, in other words, lay not in the originality of his ideas, but in the singularity of the opportunity he seized. The second objective of my book is to trace Ataturk's intellectual development, which is the least well-researched aspect of his life and work. Clearly, he was not an intellectual in the strict sense of the word, but the evolution of his ideas strongly influenced his policies. Therefore, I felt appropriate to treat Ataturk's ideas about religion in general and Islam in particular at some length in my study. The role of religion in human society and in his own country was one of Ataturk's major areas of interest. And as we all know, he presided over the emergence of the first secular republic in a Muslim country. An amalgam of scientism, materialism, social Darwinism, positivism, Turkism or proto-Turkish nationalism, and other popular theories provided Mustafa Kemal with a grand utopian framework for understanding the past and anticipating the future. He was not a Marxist, but he developed a similarly unlimited confidence in his beliefs regarding where the world was going and where his own society had its place in this evolutionary process. An unwavering scientific faith in the alleged rules of human evolution provided the certainty needed to transcendentalize the vision and implement it as an imperative imposed by modernity. Ataturk truly believed that this supreme ideal was not just the best one, but it was also essential one for Turkish society. Like other utopians, he did not let minor details, discomfiting realities, or latent contradictions stand in the way of realizing the grandeur of his vision. To understand and interpret modernity, the main pillar of his vision, he took inspiration from numerous intellectual and political trends of the late 19th and early 20th century Europe and the Ottoman world, such as German popular materialism, social Darwinism of Huxley, H.G. Wells's cosmological juxtaposition of time, space, and human in society, Gustave Le Bon's elitism, nationalism, racial anthropology, early 20th century authoritarianism, as well as the ideas of the Enlightenment. These helped him quickly construct a visionary framework that stood in substantial contradiction to the reality in which he lived. He acquired most of his ideas from Western and Ottoman popularizers of grand theories. For instance, he learned scientism and social Darwinism from Ludwig Büchner and H.G. Wells, elitism from Gustave Le Bon, nationalism from Ottoman journals, and solidarism from Ziya Gökalp. In many cases, he came to know about these European ideas from intellectual discussions that took place in the Ottoman Empire, in the course of which Ottoman intellectuals tried to apply these concepts in a domestic context. In addition, in order to advance his thesis, he did not hesitate to use theories developed by obscure scholars such as Kvergic, the creator of the so-called Sun language, theory. The quality of these substantiating, theses was of little importance, since Ataturk's principal aim was to realize a broad vision. The various ideas he collected tended to be tools for the implementation of this grand project, not goals in and of themselves. Consequently, his intellectual reach knew no limits. As a visionary, he took anything that seemed useful from any source in order to further his political program and realize his utopia. Ataturk was a product of the social realities of his time. The environment in which he lived compelled him to pick and choose certain pieces to complete his vision. His Salonican background, his education at non-religious and military schools, his service in the army, his participation in the Young Turk movement, and his membership in the Committee of Union and Progress, all these played substantial roles in shaping his views and forming his concept of utopia. Thus, not surprisingly, his leanings as a literatus reflected the tension between the traditional and the modern, evident in Ottoman society since the Tanzimat. Typical of this background were the unflinching scientism that viewed religion as a major obstacle to human progress, the perception of a single modernity to the exclusion of other possibilities, and an authoritarian organization monopolizing politics for the lofty aim of serving the public good. Not everyone who had gone through the same processes would embrace an identical vision, and some westernizers who envisaged a somewhat similar utopia had different backgrounds. But the stages of his evolution from a Salonican Muslim boy to the leader of Turkish nationalist movement undoubtedly mold Ataturk's vision and his capacity to implement it. In Ataturk's new utopian state, it was nationalism sanctified by science which would reign supreme as the new religion. This was not something that westernizers of the second constitutional period had ever proposed. Ataturk's conception of utopia as Turkish nationalist in character was bold and original. Yet, in the final analysis, he was a product of the age of nationalism. Like many literati of his generation, influenced by Durkheim's theses, He assumed that while science triumphed over religion, it was the role of nationalism to provide new identities to replace religious ones. In his view, a secular nation state in which religion played a minimum role and gradually faded away was the perfect form of political community. In his own terms, the principles on which such a community would be based should not be confused with the dogmas of books thought to have descended from the heavens. They were not inspired by clues from the heavens or the invisible world, but directly from life. Naturally, this scientific nationalist vision overtly conflicted with Islam. It was that sense that Ataturk was one of the most important shapers of the modern Muslim world. He faced dilemmas quite similar to those confronting the Muslim modernists of his day. But his vantage point was exactly the opposite. Whereas Muhammad Abduh worried about how to reconcile modern Western headgear with Islam, Mustafa Kemal was bent on reconciling Islam with the practice of wearing a hat. In his view, only an Islam open to modernity, indeed enthusiastically promoting it, would help convince the masses of the need to embrace it. His attempts at Islamic reformation, which went back to the original sources in search of arguments to justify modernity, differed dramatically from other Islamic movements of the early 20th century. Salafism, for instance, proposed a similar return to the sources, but for the purpose of recovering a pure pre-modern Islam. Atatürk did not attempt to provide Islamic responses to the challenges of modernity, but rather tried to transform Islam into a system fully embracing it. It was nevertheless his view that even a thoroughly reformed Islam ought not to play a determining role in society. The republic he founded embraced a version of laïcité more radical than that of the French Republic on which it was modeled, and it maintained strict control of organized religion. This was a wrenching program for a predominantly Muslim society of the early 20th century. And yet, Atatürk's emulators in the second half of the 20th century, such as Habib Bourguiba of Tunisia, scored fewer successes. In part, this was due to the differences between the Ottoman heartland, the Turkish heartland of the Ottoman Empire, and the more traditionally inclined Arab world. Indeed, many Ottoman practices had been judged un-Islamic within the empire's Arab provinces long before Atatürk's modernizing reforms. Nevertheless, although the Ottoman center after the Great War was ripe for change, the transformation that took place during Atatürk's lifetime was an unusually drastic one by the standards of the period. The radicalism of Atatürk's program led to the authoritarian character of his politics. Like many other transformative state builders, he harbored little tolerance for dissent or criticism, and relied on the hegemony of the Republican People's Party as his main agent of reform. Like the Committee of Union Progress leaders, who rapidly abandoned the first democratic experiment in Ottoman history, Mustafa Kemal fell back on his single-party rule in order to execute his uncompromising agenda. Since, in his eyes, the mission was historically inevitable, swinging measures were permissible to assure its success. I said that my book had actually three major objections. The third objective is that through analyzing Atatürk's life, ideas, and work, I try to explore the uneasy transition from the late Ottoman imperial order to the modern Turkish nation state. In so doing, I posit the essential continuity as opposed to the sudden rupture often depicted in the historiography on this subject. A byproduct of this investigation is a new assessment of the impact of Atatürk's legacy on modern Turkey. So, having implemented a substantial portion of his program, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died on November 10, 1938, at the age of 57. His legacy has lived on in Turkey and, to a lesser degree, in the Muslim world. His intellectual contribution did not amount to a coherent ideology, but various interpretations of his work have developed under the title of Kemalism and, more recently, Ataturkism. Although the Turkish establishment invested considerable effort in developing Kemalism as an official ideology, especially after 1960, it is often difficult to relate the evolving state doctrine of Kemalism to Atatürk's own legacy. None of this is to underestimate the dramatic transformation that he led or to belittle its present-day ramifications. In a single-minded effort to realize his utopia, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk brought about a drastic reshaping of Turkish state and society. And one might say that neither Turkey nor the Muslim world will ever be the same again. And just to conclude my presentation, once again I would like to reiterate that writing a biography is a challenge, but writing Atatürk's biography is a major challenge, and attempting to portray him as he really was is even a greater challenge. I don't know how successful my study would be. However, I sincerely hope that it would open a new door to new approaches to the study of the founder of the modern Turkish Republic. So, having said that, I'd like to, conclude my presentation. And I don't know how long, how much time, shall we have for questions and answers, but I'll be happy to take, a number of questions. Should I take questions myself, or?
We'll go to about 7:30 if it's okay.
Sure.
We'll leave it to you to direct traffic. I'll only interrupt you if you want to fill the whole time till 7:30 yourself. So if you could raise your hand, Professor Hanioglu will recognize you. We'll go from there.
Okay, please.
I have two questions, but in order not to monopolize, I'm going to ask you one, and if there's time, I will ask the second one later on. First of all, I apologize for my wearing a hat or whatever. I'd always be a bit difficult. And I also apologize for the fact that my specialization is economics and finance, so if the question is ignorant, please excuse me. But the issue that I have in mind is, there's no denying the incredible change reforms that Atatürk made. From clothing to the role of religion, whatever, which is, a way of life, changing the alphabet. These are incredible things. But in terms of the Kemalist ideas, what could he have done such that people who consider themselves Kemalists, subscribe to a list of symbolic things that they would recognize that, the Atatürk's philosophy, policy, whatever, was not something static, that it needed to be updated and it needed to be dynamic. And the fact that the inheritance of Atatürk's policies, the so-called intelligence, what is represented by CHP or whatever, has never won an election, has never been able to connect with the population, has always had the attitude that we know what's best for them. Whether it's the army or it's the CHP, what it is Democrat Party, Adalet Party, Sihanaf, whatever. All these parties have been able to establish contacts and maybe recognize the religious nature of Turkish society. But what could he have done such that he could have said it to his followers? Listen, this is valid today, but you should revise the policy, the list. You should connect with the population a lot better than what happened.
Okay, so this is $1 million question, and I don't have a good answer. So first of all, the term Kemalism, or describing actually Ataturk's ideas as an ideology occurred actually during his lifetime. In 1935, Kemalism was actually made as one of the pillars of actually it was made actually one of the pillars of policy making by the Republican People's Party in 1935. And if you read actually journals such as Ülkü, which actually represented a right-wing Kemalism, or Kadro, which represented actual left-wing Kemalism, and even during his lifetime there was right-wing and left-wing Kemalisms. And these journals actually use the term Kemalism again and again, and they actually describe Kemalism dramatically, different ways. So Kemalism is not something emerged after his death, as opposed to what many people believe, because many people believe that the idea about Kemalism, this is really something emerged, after Atatürk's death. No, during his lifetime, a discussion actually, a discussion had started, before his death. And what else could he tell his disciples or followers, to win elections? Well, that's really a tough question. Again, as I said, his program was, and his reforms were quite avant-garde reforms, especially in the standards of the early 20th century. And therefore, some of the reforms, such as actually switching call to prayers, ezan, from Arabic to Turkish, prompted resentment, in Turkish society, and therefore, some of these reforms alienated, large actually sections of society, and the idea was, I think, the idea that he had, and many of his followers actually had, was that, these people, will change. And again, but we should also put actually all these ideas in their historical context. During the late, in the second half of the 19th century, and early 20th century, the common belief, especially in the intellectual circles, was that religions actually have come, to an end. The future society will be a non-religious society, and science actually will reign supreme in the society of the future. In 1910, in 1890, people believed that the religions actually came to an end, but things developed in a very different way. And again, it was so difficult to see a revival of religion, in 1920s. And Ataturk was not the only person, who thought that, religion will be faded away, in the next, 3-4 decades, and the future society will depend on science. So one might say that, these were quite common beliefs, in the second half of the 19th century and in the early years of the 20th century. But the implementation of this program in a Muslim society was much more difficult than its implementation in a different kind of society. So therefore, therefore one might say that he could not have done anything really to make his disciples, win elections. So obviously, these people who, Ataturk himself and his followers had a different idea about, how the world actually would look like in the next actually 40, 50 years. So that was really, I think, the crux of the matter, and therefore I think turning the early Republican era into a golden age for modern Turkey is something extremely problematic. But to make a long story short, I don't think that he could really do much to make actually to make his program more attractive to people actually living in the early 21st century. Yes.
Following up to General's question, I think during the 1974 elections.
1974
elections.
Yes.
If the current election system were to be in place, the People's Republican Party under Ecevit's rule would have won a majority.
A majority, yes.
So the fact that they didn't win, comparatively speaking, is also an artifact of the election system that was changed after the 1980 coup. Now, going back to that and how the disciples would have followed, it seems to be that I am on the left side, as Inode had said earlier, and Ecevit followed on that. The populist movement that came out of the People's Republican Party, whatever that variation of the core Kemalist thing may have been, could have won something. And of course, they went into a coalition with the Islamicists, and that didn't work out that well. And what would be your take on that, following that question, that perhaps there could be some wiggle in the Holy Book that you can accommodate other things? Why did that work?
Why did
Ecevit's message work at this time? And how did it accommodate that within the People's Republican Party's framework?
Well, it was a different interpretation of Kemalism, I would say, which the masses actually found, more attractive. But I think, in my opinion, it would be more productive if we discuss instead of what kind of Kemalism would be more attractive to masses. We should maybe ask the question: should we really need something called Kemalism in the 21st century? Can't we live without an ideology called Kemalism in Turkey? So can we really historicize Ataturk as a product of his time? So in my opinion, that would be much more productive than reinterpreting actually his ideas and trying to make them fit actually in the realities of the 21st century. I think I'm not saying that we should denounce Ataturk or we should really present him as somebody who did something horrible to Turkey. Not at all. But on the other hand, for instance, why doesn't Americans actually need a Washingtonianism to get things actually going in this society? And why should we really need something called Kemalism? Can't we really live without an ideology named after Mustafa Kemal? So I think that we should. I think Turkey should be ready, to enter into a discussion of this sort instead of discussing, what kind of Kemalism would really work and what should be done in order to make Kemalism more attractive to the Turkish masses. Yes.
So there were other people similar to him, in terms of educational background and professional background. I'm thinking of Kazım Karabekir in particular. When you read his memoirs, it's obvious that Karabekir basically tries to present himself as a potential candidate to rule the country. So, and I'm thinking about some other commanders of the independence war, Fevzi Çakmak, even a man like Ali Fuat or İsmet İnönü himself. I mean, how come that he was able to basically rise to the top of all this group of people who came from very similar backgrounds and who had, similar talents, it seems?
Well, I think we should not really ignore his leadership qualities. He actually had Ataturk had exceptional leadership qualities, and again, we should not really underestimate his achievements. I think taking Turkey from 1918, to 1922 was not, something very easy, and this is why, he could actually, introduce such a radical reform program. Only a leader with such an astounding record could actually, introduce such a wrenching program in 1920s and 1930s. So because his charisma was so high that he could actually, he could propose changes, about things like, changing the call to prayers from Arabic to Turkish. Again, this is not something that anybody, can introduce and implement, more importantly. So we should not really underestimate his leadership qualities. I would say clearly there were other leaders of the the War of Independence, and I'm not saying that none of them could really become the leader of Turkey. They could have they could have become the leader of the movement or the leader of the Turkey. But if you read actually memoirs written by people actually who lived the period, for instance, if you read Halide Edip's memoirs, the Turkish ordeal, she was somewhat bitter because she had to flee the country with her husband Adnan Adıvar. They had to spend actually more than a decade in Europe in voluntary exile, and she in between lines she criticizes many policies of Mustafa Kemal, but in the end of the book she says that he was the only leader actually who could bring Turkey from 1918 to 1922. So clearly even his opponents confessed that he had exceptional leadership qualities. So that would be really the answer. Yes.
I think besides the leadership, his vision. And to answer Vefal's question, he couldn't have done anything else, just like you said. His followers should have similar, or maybe half or 1/4 of his vision to be able to win the election or to do something similar to what he did and carry on his plans or his program or his vision. So I think that what is missing is vision in the other leaders. So they can be leaders, but they didn't have the same vision. And thank God they didn't become in place of Atatürk. Otherwise we wouldn't be here probably as Turkish citizens.
Well, I kind of agree and disagree with this. I think we shouldn't really too much personalize, this. And again, I really find it a little bit far-fetched. And if we say that, well, had there not been Atatürk, there would not have been Turkey, there would not have been this, we would not have been actually here. I think this is a little bit far-fetched. But clearly, as I said, he was really, a leader of extraordinary qualities. And again, bringing Turkey from, 1918, to 1922 was not something easy. And obviously, but you should also remember that, he was actually a leader of his time. He was not a prophet. He was not telling people what they are supposed to do. In 2011, and again, therefore, turning him into a kind of holy figure won't be a good idea. And instead of saying what would Atatürk do had he been actually in this position, is something, in my opinion, counterproductive. And I think that therefore the best thing to do is to historicize him as a leader who established the Turkish Republic, who won actually the Turkish War of Independence, who led actually the nation state building in Turkey, but it would be, in my opinion, kind of counterproductive if we turn him into a kind of holy figure.
I agree, but do you suggest, do you think that we could have been at this point without him, with one of the other leaders of his time?
Well, it's too difficult to say. This is, obviously we cannot say what would have happened. This is, so this is not something that a historian can really answer. Historians can only tell, what really happened, how it happened, but it's so difficult to say, what would have really happened had there been another person actually led the Turkish War of Independence and became the leader of modern Turkey. Yes.
My question is about the role of violence in Atatürk's vision. So in your
Role of
violence.
violence.
So in your research, have you seen any concrete ideas about justification of violence for state? Has it been kind of central to his thinking, or it has been not that visible in his writings? And of course, I'm thinking about all these kind of rebellions that took place in Turkey, especially in eastern Turkey in the 20s and 30s. So was there any kind of a written document about his justification for violence, or he was mostly silent about this issue? It's in the writings.
I don't think that among his writings there is really anything about what should actually a state do against dissent and clearly like all other transformative state builders, he did not like dissent because he had a vision, he wanted to implement that vision. And therefore he did not tolerate any kind of dissent. So therefore, and this is and his program was such an avant-garde program that it could really be implemented only through authoritarian actually ways. Therefore, he did not enjoy dissent, but I cannot really remember, writings, of him explicitly, speaking about the use of, violence against dissent, so on and so forth. But again, if you look at how, certain movements of dissent, were suppressed during the period, clearly, he did not allow, much criticism and dissent. And for instance, again, what happened, during the Sheikh Said revolt and during actually the opposition to Dunning actually had, these movements were suppressed. With really in a kind of heavy-handed way.
Just a bit quick follow-up question.
Yeah.
But I think you must say that he conceptualized violence not only a reaction against dissent, but also a constructive force that can transform the society, which is basically more similar to maybe what the Soviet Union did during the same period. Like conceptualizing violence as a more constructive and generative force rather than just a reaction against.
Sure, but this was something very common, in the first half of the 20th century. Obviously, violence and use of force were viewed quite differently than they are viewed actually modern day. Yes.
You mentioned that Ataturk was greatly influenced by European writers. I didn't hear very well, but I think you mentioned the Soviet Union, and I wonder if there was any intellectual overlap that you saw in your research with the emerging Communist Party, Lenin, Stalin, and Ataturk. Because both of them coming out, although Ataturk was not a communist, secularist, nationalist ideologies emerging from a fallen empire. If you saw any kind of intellectual overlap there.
There wasn't really much overlap, but during actually in the period between 1920 and 1922, Ataturk really posed, I would say, or masqueraded as a Muslim Bolshevik, because as we all know, Turkish War of Independence was a war actually fought with Russian arms and Indian Muslim money. So that the arms were coming from Russia and the money was coming from Indian Muslims. So therefore, despite his secularist and anti-communist proclivities, Ataturk really masqueraded as a Muslim communist. If you read actually his speeches at the parliament at that time, or if you read his letters sent to comrade Lenin, this is how he addressed Lenin, or comrade Stalin, how he addressed Stalin at that time. If you read those letters, you might think that he was somebody advancing ideas similar to those of Sultan Galiyev, this the Muslim communist of the post 1917. But in reality, he never believed in such ideas. Later on, as you all know, in 1960s, in early 1970s, Turkish left attempted actually to portray Ataturk as a Bolshevik by actually using his sayings and writings of this period. But clearly, he despised, he loathed, communism. And he was not, obviously, he was not an Islamist, but he spoke like an Islamist. He spoke about, the previous, caliphates, how they were, destroyed by crusaders. He was trying to actually save the last, caliphate. So when you read actually his writings or speeches of that period, that 2.5-year period, you might end up saying that he was a Muslim Bolshevik, but he was not. So also in 1921, he signed actually a treaty with the Bolsheviks, and that treaty actually was a big success. And because the Soviets actually recognized the Ankara government as a legitimate government of Turkey as against the Sultan's government in Istanbul. So clearly he played his cards very wisely, and acted like, or masqueraded like a Muslim Bolshevik for 2.5 years. But in general, the impact of the Bolshevik movement was very little. In fact, he actually there was actually a Turkish Communist Party, a genuine Turkish Communist Party established in the Soviet Union by Turkish emigres, and in order to counter the work of this party, he also established an official Communist Party of Turkey, and asked his closest associates actually become members of that party. But obviously the Comintern did not recognize that fake Communist Party as a Communist Party, and now we learn that because a scholar actually has recently published some Russian documents about his dealings with the Soviets, and then he actually warned the Soviets by asking them not to support this genuine, Turkish communist movement. And he said something very interesting. He said, well, in Turkey, even communism is our business. So he said, look, deal with us and not with these, folks. We are the real power here. Interestingly enough, despite his heavy-handed, treatment of Turkish left, Mustafa Kemal became actually an idol of later socialist movements, also Turkish left, in 1970s. Yes.
It's well known that one of Ataturk's principles is ostensibly republicanism.
Yeah.
And we see a large discrepancy between Ataturk's ideological commitments to this principle and his actions. So I would like to ask, what do you think is Ataturk's interpretation of republicanism? What does it mean to be republican in Ataturk's mind? And if you think his particular interpretation of republicanism played a causal role in the early institutions in the design of the new republic, and especially of the wartime legislature in 1920s. So what is Ataturk's idea of republicanism?
Okay. So obviously, Ataturk was not a political scientist. He was not, reading thousands of books on republicanism. And among actually the books that he read was a book written by Babanzadeh Ahmet Naim. He published a book on ideas on constitutionalism. And there's a section on Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas about republicanism. So we understand that he read that section very carefully, underlined many parts of it, and he was especially struck actually by a definition by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau in his social contract says that every legitimate government is republican. So he liked this idea very much. So he really described republicanism along those lines. And also, we should also remember that he was somebody, raised actually during the time of French Third Republic. So therefore, in his eyes, the French Third Republic was the best example of a republic. And also, therefore, he tried to create a model of the French Third Republic in Turkey. And also he took this, his idea of laïcité, secularism, maybe secularism is not the right term, to refer to it, but he took this idea from the laïcité of the Third Republic, and he thought that he could actually win a similar victory to that of the Third Republic's victory in 1905. So clearly, he took these ideas all from Rousseau and French sources. Yes.
All questions up to now were about Ataturk, but I would like to ask a question about the book about Ataturk that you have written and that has come out here. First of all, let me congratulate you. It's quite a challenge to write something new and different about Ataturk. And it's also difficult to write an intellectual biography of somebody who is not an intellectual, who was a man of action, a soldier and a man of action. Therefore, eclectic and pragmatic, as he was wont to be. Now, I have a couple of questions. First of all, have you, to some degree, been inspired by Sherif Mardin's book on the ideology of the Young Turks, and to what extent can you draw a parallel between that book and what you have written and that we will hopefully read very soon? That's my first question. And secondly,
Rita has a copy of it, so that you can borrow this from. Yeah, she has the only copy of the book that exists.
Wow.
It's going to be on
Well, I have an electronic copy that I got from Amazon. So.
Oh, okay.
Reading stars now.
And secondly, I've read a number of biographies in English of Mustafa Kemal. Gortkin, Ross, what's his name,
Andrew Mango.
Klaus
Kreiser.
Armstrong.
plus some Turkish biographies, Tek Adam, Şevket Süreyya, and all that. How do you differentiate your book from all these? If you, very briefly, in a couple of sentences, stressing the main points of differentiation, what would you say? How is it different from all these? If you start the biographies of Atatürk, they would fill
Sure.
all these book capitals.
Yeah, it is a different. First of all, it is not a biography. It's not a biography in the strict sense of the word. It has nothing about his personal life. It's only about his ideas and intellectual, achievements or initiations. So clearly, there is nothing, very little, information. Obviously, I have to say that he was born either in 1880 or 1881. But that's the only thing. And then I have to say, obviously, he died in 1938. But other than that, there is nothing about his personal life. And therefore, it's not really a biography of that sense. So it really differs quite a bit, from biographies produced by, Şevket Süreyya Aydemir, Andrew Mango, Klaus Kreiser, because they all deal with his personal life. For instance, Mango actually has a chapter about, about the origins of his family, whether his grandfather had red hair or he was blonde, things like that. There's nothing of that sort actually in my book. So I'm not saying that that's something wrong. Obviously, a real biography should include actually those things as well. I'm not saying that this is not a good way of writing biography, not at all. My actually book is an intellectual biography, but as you said, it's difficult to write an intellectual biography about someone who was not an intellectual. He was not somebody like, Karl Marx, or he was not somebody like Auguste Comte, So therefore, it is somewhat difficult. What is really original in my book is, for the first time, I very carefully examined all the books that he read, the passages that he underlined actually in books, the actually notes that he scribbled actually on margins, the actually comments that he made about books. Also, as we all know, or many people, it's a well-known fact, but very few people write about them. Atatürk really edited the four-volume set of history books taught at high schools actually, in Turkey between 1931 and 1941. So I also, read them very carefully and try to find out from actually which sources he took these ideas. And for instance, most of these ideas were taken by Leonel Caetani's, book Anali del Islam. So clearly, many people thought that these were Atatürk's own ideas about Islam, about the emergence of Islam, but these were not his own, original ideas. He interpreted, obviously, them. And again, for instance, nobody really wrote about the impact of H.G. Wells on Atatürk. And his history book on Atatürk. So I think it's gonna be a interesting source to understand from which sources actually Atatürk took these ideas. Because as I said, most of the time, Turkish historiography, also some foreign scholars, approach him as a maker of history, as if nothing really influenced him, as if he lived actually in total isolation, as if he was not reading anything, just thinking about important subjects and then producing theories about them. So that's really that would be really the difference, the major difference. But again, my book has no claim of being actually a comprehensive biography of Atatürk's life, obviously. And as I said, there is almost nothing about his personal life in the book. And the second question is, clearly, Sheriff Martin's book on the political ideas of the Young Turks is one of the best pieces of intellectual history. So in a way, I kind of influenced by that book, also by his book on young Ottomans, in which he tried actually to find the roots of the ideas advanced actually by the Young Turks and young Ottomans. But doing it for Ataturk actually was much more difficult, because he was not really somebody publishing a journal like the Young Turks. It's obviously when you write something about Ahmet Reza, it's much more easier because he published journals both in French and Turkish, so that you write his articles and say, okay, he said this in 1901, he said something different in 1911. But for Ataturk, it's much more difficult. It's like doing archaeology. So it was kind of difficult. Again, it's writing an intellectual biography of somebody who was not an intellectual in the strict sense of the word. Is much more. It's much more daunting than really writing a biography about somebody who was an intellectual and produced intellectual material.
May I add one item? Sure. Ataturk did write a long text, one long text, the Nutuk.
Yeah.
And a critical edition of the Nutuk is on the way now. It's going to appear very soon.
Yeah, I very much like to see that publication, but I don't know, for some reason it did not appear. But again, Nutuk, Ataturk wrote something which is a long piece, and again it's a very well written piece. One other thing about Ataturk is that he really writes very well. Unlike for instance when you read Ataturk's writings and compare actually his writings with the writings of his peers of that time. For instance, you can compare it with Karabekir. He writes extremely well. He
writes like a soldier. Ataturk writes like a stylist.
Exactly. He has actually a style, and he really writes beautifully. That's another actually
That's what it is. He's intellectual in a way.
Clearly, he doesn't really write. He doesn't really simply write, as you said, like Karabekir, a simple soldier. So he really writes in a very elegant way. But Nutuk, in the final analysis, it's really a hybrid of a memoir and history. He writes the history of the period between 1918 and 1927 from his vantage point, and with the exception of the final peroration, through which he entrusted actually the Turkish Republic to the Turkish youth. It's not a book about an ideology. It describes what was the situation in the Ottoman Empire in 1918, what happened afterwards, how he seized power, and then he describes actually his reforms up to 1927. But it's not a book of it's not really a book comparable to books of, let's say, I would say Lenin, for instance. It's not really a book speaking about his ideology, his ideas, and telling actually his disciples what to do, what not to do. It's not that kind of a book.
I have my second and last question is about Mango talks in quite detail in sort of personal way about him and his ruckus professor companion and so on and so forth. Now, from your perspective on the research you've done, did anybody have influence on him? I mean, did he have an open mind about, let's say, an issue that he's thinking of implementing, and he sort of was democratic, at least in the sense of listening to people, and who influenced him, if anybody, or was he, this is it, this is what we're going to do, and I know the truth? So, among his dinner companions or outside, who influenced Ataturk after he came, if any?
Yeah. Those actually long dinners lasted until small hours, of the day. They were really very interesting because clearly, for instance, there was a very interesting, series produced by Henry Baer on the evolution of humanity. That was really a series influenced Ataturk enormously because Ataturk got very interested in anthropology in late 1920s, early 1930s. So what was happening? He was asking, his companions or these dinner companions to read actually one of those books and then make a presentation, and then they were really having a discussion on the subject. So he was reading them as well because I looked at the books that he read. So he clearly read a number of books from those series, and those series really influenced him enormously. Also Eugène Pitard, a major anthropologist, a Swiss anthropologist of 1920s, 1930s, influenced him immensely, and he really, in my opinion, he owed actually Turkish history thesis to Pitard. But to make a long story short, at those dinner actually discussions, he was asking people to make presentations, to advance ideas, but then, as far as I understand, in the end, his ideas always prevailed. And he listened to people. He asked, he let them make presentations. But then he actually, his ideas, always, prevailed. For instance, in 1928, he was listening to a music, concert in Sarayburnu. And again, they were having, dinner. And there was a famous Egyptian, singer, Munir al-Mehdiya, singing. And during that, this was not actually the best, forum to discuss, a change in alphabet. So at this juncture, Ataturk decided that, a change to a modified Latin alphabet would be best for Turkey. Everybody, at the table opposed, saying that, when I say opposed, they were not opposed, but he ordered an immediate change. And then he immediately ordered, actually, a number of people in his entourage to go and actually write the names of the ships in Latin characters. So while they were eating, some people started to paint, actually, the names of ships, actually, in Latin characters. And then, but everybody was saying, look, this is going to be a big change. We need time for that. Why don't we actually publish one or two columns, in every newspaper in Latin characters, and the rest actually in the Arabo-Persian script, and then have a kind of gradual change. He said, no, we just will issue a law in a couple of weeks, and then have a immediate switch. So clearly, he was listening to people, but in the end, his ideas always prevailed. But again, these at these dinners, all these ideas were discussed in detail.
Professor Hanioglu, should we take one more question because we're pushing time?
There are, I think.
I know we have lots of questions. We're not going to be able to conclude everything.
So why don't you?
Why don't we take one more because we do have to stop.
Why don't you?
Apologies.
Could I take the question of the lady sitting?
You discussed the Mustafa Kemal was a product of his time, and you discussed at length the sources of his ideology, and was a member of the Atatürk movement, and was influenced by Ideological and by Western ideas. Have you found any indication why his Westernization pitch was so extreme? I mean, he carried it to extreme, as you just described, the alphabet change in 2 weeks. de-Islamization in the radical way. Why he was such a radical and such a, I say, extremist in his ideology, because it doesn't follow, I mean, his roots, his ideological roots from Ataturk, from Atatürkist, from Western ideologies, he was not a communist, as you said.
Yeah.
So he would not be influenced by their.
Okay, that's an important question. First of all, we have to remember that there was actually a group of intellectuals in the Ottoman Empire called Westernists or Garpçılar. This is how they were called in Turkish, and these people published actually a journal called İçtihat. This, ironically, this is really a very, strange, name for a, kind of super, for a journal advocating super Westernization. But the leaders of this movement, and a number of them, were later made deputies in the parliament by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and these people. Really created, they really envisaged a kind of fully westernized Ottoman Empire. And they actually criticized Islam in a very harsh way. In such a harsh way that when Sharif, Hussein of Mecca revolted in 1916, he actually, in his manifesto, he actually gave the publication of that journal as one of the reasons of his revolt. He said that, well, these people, made fun actually of Islam in Istanbul, and the Unionist government did not do anything against them. So this is why I'm really rebelling against the state. So and these people discuss all these actually reforms, and one of them, one of these actually leaders, Kılıçzade Hakkı Bey, later he became Hakkı Kılıçoğlu after the surname reform of 1934, he actually published a program of Westernization in 1913. And this program really, included all the changes that Mustafa Kemal later on actually did. The abolition of the fez, replacement of it with a European type of hat, a switch from Arabo-Persian alphabet to the Latin alphabet, the closure of the madrasas, and the establishment of European-style universities in their stead. So clearly these were, but again, these ideas, this group was such a marginal group, and most of the society viewed actually these ideas as ruminations of some crazy, pundits. And this journal was actually closed down, I don't know how many times, by authorities. So clearly these were not, these radical ideas were not very novel. They had been discussed between 1908 and 1918. But again, I'm not also, saying that Mustafa Kemal simply took actually a program and implemented it. No, we can also see his imprints, on this program. And again, as you said, most of the time he did go for the most radical alternative on the offer. For instance, people proposed a reform of the Arabo-Persian alphabet. They said no, let's switch to the Latin alphabet. And again, his reforms, his ideas of reforming Islam were extremely radical reforms of his time. So clearly. He took actually these radical ideas, and one might say that he made them more radical. But clearly, these radical ideas were available, you know, in 1920s. That's you know, I would like to say.
I know we have more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So please join me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.